Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on October the 4th. So I was it was a decent week really to progress the soybean harvest, and even I saw some corn harvest getting started out there. Yields on both corn and soybeans just continue to impress. With better than expected yields across most of the state. We just continue to take off soybean plots, and our 1.9, our 2.2, and our 2.6 varieties. They just continue to prove why they're out there and are just our top sellers across a wide range of acres here in Michigan. Now, on today's podcast, I wanted to share a few thoughts that I've just kind of had come across my mind in driving across the state this past week. And I do have a special guest back with me, Dr. Marty Chilvers from Michigan State University, to talk about his take on tar spot in Michigan this year. But starting out, I drove by some double crop soybeans this week, and it got me wondering about their potential as the season progresses. On one hand, they got probably the best start we could have ever asked for if we were to even consider planting double crop soybeans in Michigan. The wheat harvest came early. We had plenty of moisture, and the soils were really in great condition to plant. Yeah, then came August and September with the rains that kind of turned off at different times across the state. And that probably affected their ability to hold flowers and develop pods. Now, I do believe that for those folks that did keep getting the rains through the middle of September, they could be in for a pleasant surprise. But those folks, especially in the southern part of the state who maybe missed most of those rains in August and September, they may be a little bit more disappointed. Now, at the end of the day, planting double crop soybeans in Michigan is a challenge. And, if we can get 20 or more bushels per acre from that crop, we'd probably consider that a win. Now, this year, we'll probably have more winners than losers from this venture, especially if we can probably hold off that first frost for a few more weeks. Now, I also wanted to address something interesting I see every year in soybeans, and that is these scattered bright green plants in and amongst the fully mature plants. Now, if you go out in the field and you take a closer look at that green plant, oftentimes you'll notice that instead of having normal pods at each of the nodes, what you'll see is this cluster of mini pods that are just less than a quarter inch in length. And these plants are actually affected by a virus. It's known as either the tobacco mosaic virus or ring spot virus. And this virus actually is carried by insects that can then infest scattered plants across the field in the season. And that happens early in the season. And it causes this disruption in the reproductive system of that soybean plant, and therefore causing these odd plants kind of scattered throughout the field. So the good news is that there's normally not enough of those plants to really affect anything economically as far as yields in the field, but it's interesting to see and just kind of interesting to understand what's causing this oddity out in your fields. Now, moving back to corn, I'm excited to have Dr. Marty Chilvers back on the podcast this week to share his thoughts on tar spot in Michigan this year. So welcome, Dr. Chilvers.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
Absolutely. So, what I'm thinking is, if I was a betting man this past summer, I would have laid money on the fact that this was going to be just a record year for tar spot development in Michigan. Now, I can find it in most every field across the state currently, but it just seems to maybe came in later than expected. And so I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on tar spot this year?
Yeah, Charles. June had me pretty concerned with tar spot. I thought we might be setting up for something similar to 2021. We had a lot of moisture early during the season, and there were some early detections of tar spot, even in June. But I think that warm July really slowed things down. When we look at the tar spotter app and the modeling work that's gone behind that to develop a risk prediction tool, temperature is a really important driving parameter there. And what we tend to see is that the cooler temperatures are far more favorable for disease development. So there's a lot of factors at play, which makes it very challenging. And because the disease, increases over time, it also makes it kind of challenging. It's not just a 1 or 2 week period we have to look at in terms of risk. We have to evaluate progression during the season. So that's why scouting is really during the season is really really important.
Now, I saw a lot of folks using fungicide out there to manage tar spot because it was getting started early in places. And, I've always been a firm believer that fungicide, even before we saw tar spot, was one of those things that had a positive return on investment in corn when applied, at that R1 type stage. But, what do you see on fungicides and their effectiveness and maybe one versus two fungicides this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally what we've seen in our trials, because the pressure's been pretty light this year, a single application tended to do pretty well. We're going to pull that, we have a lot of data that we collect, and we'll be pulling that apart, especially as we collect that yield data here yet this month and, pull that together. And in the past as well, over the years, generally, a single well-timed fungicide application does a really good job at managing tar spot. There are certainly situations though where a second application may be needed, especially if for some reason we want to go a little bit earlier with a fungicide, then you may very well need a follow-up application later, just depending on the conditions and then how much disease is developing.
Well, you talk about disease there, and I think, I saw a lot of other diseases as well. Northern corn leaf blight, I think, is one that really seemed to show up a lot this year. And I guess, your thoughts on multiple diseases working together out there on the crop.
Yeah, and that's a really important thing to consider. And I like your comment about that VTR1, that tassel silking timing. Um, so in general, what we've seen over the year is you're comparing early applications, V6, V8 to that VTR1. We tend to see a much better return on investment likelihood at that VTR1 because then we're actually controlling disease for all of those leaves that are going to be there throughout the remainder of the season. This year we had some strip trials looking at management of disease in silage, and it was pretty evident that where the fungicide had been put on, things looked much greener on that corn silage. So that was interesting. We'll have to wait until we get all the quality data back to see how much things were driven. And that project was actually set up to look at tar spot, but it was northern leaf blight that was the main culprit out there and really creating some big differences. So I think that's another good reminder. Don't get hyper focused on just tar spot. We have to be managing northern leaf blight, which is another pretty common disease that we have out there.
Well, and I've been seeing a lot of differences. As an agronomist out there, it's a great time for me to evaluate genetics, evaluate hybrid performance based upon disease tolerance, both northern and tar spot out there, and I'm seeing some big differences. I guess my question for you is on those hybrids that are just littered with tar spot right now that just don't seem to have any genetic tolerance in there. You know, um, what do you think as far as concern for getting this crop harvested and not losing that with stalk degradation and other things out there?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a few spots in the state where tar spot is still pretty heavy. I mean, on average, we're not looking too bad, but yeah, there are certainly some areas. So certainly, tar spot can take plants down, create all sorts of lodging issues. So we'd suggest getting out doing a push test to check for standability and just try and get into those fields as early as you can. Essentially, if there is heavy tar spot in there, it is going to dry those plants out quicker, help with dry down. Not that not that that's the intention, but right.
Yeah.
But be very aware of that. I know in years past we've had some great crops, but they've ended up on the ground because we've had heavy tar spot come in at the end and just rob us of stalk integrity. So it's a very important thing to go and check.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up because, on this podcast, one of the things I really like to do is focus on what is actionable next for our
Mhm.
listeners. And so push tests are huge. And And then I guess I'm thinking about next year. What's actionable for next year? Any thoughts on
Yeah.
going into next year for tar spot?
So a really interesting one is tillage. And we might all think that, yep, let's get in and till that, that residue up to try and minimize tar spot. But there's been many fields over the years where we haven't had corn in for many years, plant corn, and then we get very, very heavy tar spot infestation. And just looking at our small plot work, I was talking to my colleague in Wisconsin, and we both saw the same thing this year. In our till area, we actually ended up with more tar spot than a no-till plots.
Interesting.
So it wasn't just Michigan. Wisconsin saw that too. So my thought on that is that perhaps there's some dynamics. I think we did have faster germination where we had tillage, better placement of seed and whatnot. So there's a lot of dynamics that really um, drive disease and canopy. When it's there, when it's not there, all those things really do have an impact. And I remember seeing that with strike rust in wheat this year as well,
Hmm.
just on campus. It was only one observation, so I have to be careful how much we sort of lean into that. But what we'd noticed in the early planted wheat that it had more tar spot than the late planted wheat. So again, it makes me wonder about canopy development at the time of infection and whether that drove anything. I've also heard from other industry members that a lot of early planted fields had more tar spot than the later planted fields. So it's a tough disease. We actually delayed planting some of our trials this year, to try and drive up the amount of tar spot with the thought of, letting the epidemic get started in the area and having our material out there and greener for a little bit longer. And I don't think that necessarily worked for us this year.
Well, it's very interesting, and it just goes to prove we've got a lot more to learn as we go. And really appreciate your work there, Dr. Chilvers and Michigan State, in trying to help us continue to work better and against this disease out there. So, with that, I certainly hope that everybody here had a great week this week and plans for an even better week ahead. So, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Michigan agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great weekend.